Ele hadvarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael. These are the words that Moses spoke to all of Israel. A couple things are noteworthy in this opening line of Devarim. One is the redundancy of Ela, Vaidaber Moshe, and Moses spoke to all of Israel. But there's a redundancy of Ela Hadvarim. These are the words that Moses spoke. Of course, if he spoke words. And the other thing that's a tension that's unusual is it's often El B'nai Yisrael, that he spoke to the children of Israel. But here, instead of B'nai, children, it's El Kol Yisrael, to all of Israel, somehow emphasizing the need for everybody to count, to listen. I shared in the introduction a teaching of my teacher and friend, Rabbi Abraham Twersky, where he commented in reference to the contrast between Moses at the burning bush saying, "I am not a man of words," to now becoming identified with Devarim, a long, continuous display of oratory. And the commentary was, it's not that Moses learned how to speak in the course of his years of leadership, but rather he had deepened his sense of mission. And it's out of that sense of having led the people that he now had a sense of purpose in sharing with the people these words. And these words are very important words as we begin them. And this Parsha of Devarim is always read before Tisha B'Av. In fact, today is Tisha B'Av, meaning today is the 9th of Av, but we don't mark a time of mourning on the Sabbath, and so it gets postponed till tonight and tomorrow, the 10th of Av. Devarim is always read as the beginning of a preparation for entering into the Promised Land. And in the beginning of Devarim, which was not part of our reading, was Moses' addressing the people over their key failure. Not the people before him, but their parents. Their key failure of having lacked the will and the faith to have entered into the Promised Land some 38 years before. And as we discussed it in our Parshat HaShavua group, the question was, because Moses kind of changes his description. It's a description of the spies having come back, as Moses describes it in Deuteronomy, with the fruits of the land. And then Moses says, but you lacked the courage, the faith to go into the land. The part that's missing in Moses' retelling is that 10 of the 12 spies said, we can't do it. The people there are giants. And we were like grasshoppers in their eyes. So the prompt of words to turn the people toward fearfulness is omitted in this account. In Moses' telling, the blame is all squarely on the people themselves for their lack of faithfulness. What may have been the prompt is no longer essential. What matters is what the people did not do, which was move forward faithfully. And so this is the Parsha, Deuteronomy, in which Moses recounts the past with words of chastisement. Indeed, that's one of the word plays on Ele Hadvarim. Not only is it these are the words or these are the matters, but a B is called a Devorah, and that's the same root. And a Devorah is the ability to provide honey, sweetness, and the ability to sting. But here's the part that I gained also in preparing for today about a bee, is that when a bee stings, a bee loses its life, right? The stinger remains, pulled out, the bee dies. And the commentary was that one can only chastise as Moses does when it's not about him, when he indeed is prepared even to give his life for the people. And so as the bearer, as the devorah of the devarim, of the words, Moses' chastisement are chastisements of love, Yisurin shel ahava, but necessary to be heard. For if the people are to enter into the land and they are to be successful as a people in covenant with God, they need to own the past and the pain of the past as their own. One of the commentaries I read this week about news was that you cannot select what you are going to feel. If you try and numb yourself to pain, you also numb yourself to pleasure and celebration. You can't choose if you numb yourself. When you numb yourself, you're just numb. You do not feel. In order to feel the celebration of the entry into the land, in order to feel the collective possibilities of the future, there needs to be an openness to also own the pain of the past. Which explains also why we continue to observe Tisha B'Av. There was a big debate. It's not such a debate these years as things have rhythms. And the big debate after the creation of the state of Israel was, why have Tisha B'Av now that we've returned? Why mourn for the temple? Why mourn for a longing of being dispersed when we've been regathered? And what carried the tradition forward was two things. One, it's tradition. You can't change tradition. But the other was a sense that it's not just one temple that was destroyed, it was two. And it can happen a third time. Never take for granted what you have. One must be vigilant in protecting the state of Israel. Do not assume that because we have an army, that we will be victorious indefinitely. You cannot take for granted what you have. But there's another dimension that is distinctly Jewish, and this is as follows. We did not make ourselves into victims. We made ourselves into sinners. When we read the Haftorah that David just chanted so beautifully from Isaiah, not only does the melody reflect what we will read tonight in the book of Lamentations, but so does the theme, which is, why was the temple destroyed? Because you were no longer faithful to God's principles. God gave the Babylonians in 586 the power to destroy the temple because the leaders had become greedy and corrupt. That was what David chanted in reference to that verse of Echa. No longer cared about the widow and the orphan in that verse of Echa of 25 plus 100 years ago. And so what's distinctive about Judaism, and Talmud will reflect it, is the Babylonians and later the Romans are seen as God's instruments for punishment for the failure of the people to have lived up to ethical ideals. Because that's what it is to be Jewish, not to be a tribe. That's what Deuteronomy focuses in on, particularly next week with Ve'et Hanan. It is to be a people that is in relationship with God, seeing the world through God's eyes, taking care of those fellow children of God with a compassion and with justice. And so back to the Talmud and how it flips Tisha B'Av, it will say, why was the first temple destroyed? Because of Avodah Zarah, because of idolatry. Though again, back to Isaiah, idolatry is not just worshiping stones. Idolatry is failing to acknowledge God's ethical demands as the guidance for how to live as a community. That too is idolatry. Idolatry, as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel emphasizes, is turning means into ends, or if you will, justifying ends by corrupt means. That too is idolatry. When you make a means that which is a vehicle for a greater good, the end in itself, that narrows God and is idolatry. And the rabbis say, why was the second temple destroyed? There was no longer a claim of idolatry as such. And they said because of sinat chinam, because of hatred for free. And as described by Josephus and others who describe the siege of the Romans, the Jews went to war with each other, destroying the food that had been preserved. And that weakened them and allowed the Romans to conquer. And so the rabbis living soon after that destruction said it was because of our hatred for each other, for our lack of unity as a community, that God punished us. Now that's troubling. It's troubling to always be pointing at oneself, but that's what a religious people does, not a tribe alone. A religious people says we must live up to ideals or God will abandon us, or if you will, the natural consequence of our failure to live up to ethical guidelines is a quality of nihilism, a quality of self-destruction that will open us to demise. That's how we've done it historically. I find value in it in the following way. To be a victim is a terrible place to be as a mindset. A victim has no control. That's depression, or you feel boxed in, but more. A victim doesn't have the willfulness, that's depression too, to change, to move forward, to see possibility. And so the way our rabbis understood Tisha B'Av and the tragedies that we've incurred as a people is our lack of collectivity and our lack of ethical living that has done us in. And that inspires me not to always live up to that ideal of pointing the finger at ourselves collectively. And again, collectively, it's not about what I did or you did. It's about what we did. Not all Israelites were idolaters. Not all Israelites were at war with each other. But what the rabbis say is when society operates in that way, things fall apart. And so tonight on Tisha B'Av, as we sit on the floor and the lights are turned off and the candles are lit, in our case, electric candles, we will mourn, we will feel pain. And that will allow us to feel celebration. You know that Mincha, tomorrow afternoon, we begin to feel celebration because the rabbis teach that no less than the Mashiach, the Messiah, will be born on Tisha B'Av. That out of darkness, in that darkest moment, when it is darkest, is when the light of a new day begins to form. It was no less after the darkness of the Shoah, when Jews felt so weak, so vanquished, so dehumanized. When we were at our lowest, perhaps in our history, in 1945, that slowly a light began to emerge. But 3 years later, the creation of a state of Israel after 2,000 years. And so only when we own pain is there celebration to be experienced too. And Tisha B'Av leads to Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av, which is our Sadie Hawkins Day, of celebration in the fields of brides and grooms. That when things look dark, it doesn't mean that they will remain. Or as I am told, my dear friend Rabbi Adam Greenwald said when he spoke here recently, when it feels like the darkness of the tomb, know that it can be the darkness too of the womb. New beginnings may emerge. Which leads me to know that I'm out of time. That was a long introduction. But I'll just say a word. I am very concerned for our country, on this week more than most. I teased when I came back from my sabbatical with Linda to say, when you read the newspapers abroad, which is just headlines of what's going on in the United States, what you see is violence. And when we made choices of where to travel on our sabbatical, one of the considerations is danger. You know, if it's a dangerous place, you think twice. And I teased that I would be scared to go to America if I didn't live here. Now, this last week, there were travel warnings against America, but they weren't just by Venezuela and a couple of other South American countries. I believe Japan was one of those countries too. And understandably so. The level of violence in America, public violence, mass shootings, mass slayings, is beyond anywhere else in the world except in a war zone, maybe Yemen. And one is left confused by it. If we had more time, we might have a public conversation, which I was debating. Knowing that we have different political positions in the room, we listen to different pundits, but that's not what I'm concerned about. What I'm concerned about is our unity as a nation. For the opening comment about Moses, I think is right. Namely, what's the difference between Moses as a man without words and a man with words is that he now has a renewed sense of purpose and common purpose. When the question is raised, why are young white men engaging in mass murders in America? And in the last week, it was somebody from the right and it was somebody from the left in terms of political postings. What is going on in America that people are behaving in those ways? I will add, there is no more mental illness in America percentage-wise than in many places in the world. That's reality. We can do more for the mentally ill in America. But there is other things going on. And what I sense is going on, and I don't know the answer, is a renewal of shared belonging, shared purpose. A closing image. The Dalai Lama wanted to know how we as Jews had survived in the aftermath of the destruction of our land. He was leading a people dispersed from Tibet. And so in 1988, he had his first meeting with rabbis in Dar es Salaam in India. And he wanted to know what was the secret to Jewish survival. And a number of the rabbis, it's a wonderful book called The Jew and the Lotus by Roger Kamenetz, a poet who's been a guest in our community, recounts those week-long meetings with the Dalai Lama. One rabbi said, it's Shabbat. Every week coming together as a community and reconnecting to God, that's allowed us to survive. Another rabbi, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, says it's Passover. Passover, because what you need to do, Dalai Lama, is create a ritual where you bring your people together at least once a year And as families, describe where you come from, who you are, your history, because that creates your identity. And then you don't need a land. And then, according to Professor Reuven Kimmelman, who's also been a guest in our community, what the Dalai Lama said to them was as follows: I hear the power of your past memories. I hear the resonance of your rituals. But I suspect that the only thing that kept you a people was your future. You don't make sacrifices for your past, nor even for the present. What kept you Jews a people was the sense that you had a mission. And believing that God counted on you to fulfill a mission is why you are still here today. Indeed, you leave me with that challenge of what is to be the mission of my people. Ribono Shalom, Master of the universe, we live in a time of pain. We live in a time of disunity. We live in a time of fear. Allow us to come back together. May we do so by reclaiming as Americans and as Jews a sense of mission. Amen.